She was already at the door when I said it. Not turning back, not pausing, just that laugh. Brief, light, the kind that carries no malice on the surface and leaves something underneath you can't immediately name. Then the door closed and the porch light stayed on, and I stood in the driveway of our house in Scottsdale with my car keys still in my hand and the desert night pressing warm and dark around me, and a feeling I didn't have a word for yet sitting squarely in the center of my chest. "I trust you," I had said, standing right there, between the car and the front steps, while she adjusted the strap of her dress and checked her phone and told me not to wait up. It had come out of nowhere, or not nowhere, out of the low-frequency hum that had been running under things for weeks, the hum I had been attributing to work stress and seasonal restlessness and the ordinary friction of two people sharing a life. I had said it and meant it and believed it, and she had laughed and walked inside without looking at me, and I had stood there in the driveway holding my keys and not quite knowing what had just happened. I drove to the hardware store. I bought caulk I didn't need. I drove home and sat in the kitchen and waited for a text that came at 1:14 in the morning. "Staying at Prius, don't worry." I put my phone face down on the counter and went to bed. I did not sleep. My name is Cal. Was, at the point this story begins, 36 years old, a project estimator for a mid-sized civil contracting firm that handled commercial builds across the Phoenix metro. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that fills a room at a dinner party, but the kind that pays well and demands precision and suits the particular way my brain is organized, sequentially, logically, with a strong preference for variables that behave the way variables are supposed to behave. Sasha and I had been married 7 years. We had met through a mutual friend at a rooftop event in Old Town Scottsdale. She was working the event, moving through the crowd with the controlled efficiency of someone who organized chaos for a living, and I had been immediately and comprehensively struck by the specific quality of her attention when she finally turned it on me. She was, in every measurable sense, the most present person I had ever met. When Sasha was with you, she was entirely with you. That quality, which I had spent 7 years believing was mine, was, I was beginning to understand, a professional skill as much as a personal one. She coordinated events for a living. High-end corporate parties, gallery openings, venue launches. Her world was full of promoters and vendors and the specific social ecosystem of Scottsdale nightlife, which was its own elaborate organism with its own rules and currencies. I had always existed adjacent to that world, present at the events that required a spouse, absent from the ones that didn't, comfortable with the separation because I trusted her and because the work itself was genuinely demanding and I understood demanding work. We had agreed, early, not to have children. It was the right decision for us both, we had said, and we had meant it, and the absence of children had given us a particular kind of freedom, flexible schedules, spontaneous travel, a social life that didn't require the logistical machinery of parenthood. It had also, I was starting to understand, given Sasha a particular kind of freedom that was not entirely shared. The night she laughed and walked inside was a Thursday in late April. By the following Saturday, I had begun to understand that the laugh was not nothing. Priya was Sasha's closest friend, a woman I genuinely liked, sharp and warm in equal measure, the kind of person who gave honest opinions without cruelty. She and Sasha had been friends since college, which meant their friendship had a depth and a shorthand that I had always respected from a comfortable distance. When Sasha said she was staying at Priya's, I had no reason to doubt it. The reason arrived the following morning. I ran into Priya at a coffee place on Camelback Road. Not arranged, just the specific geography of a neighborhood where two people's Saturday routines occasionally overlapped. She was alone with a book and a flat white and the relaxed demeanor of a woman spending a morning entirely to herself. I almost didn't say anything. She looked up first. "Cal." Warm, genuine. "How are you?" "Good." "You." "Lazy Saturday." She held up the book. Then, with the casual ease of someone making conversation, "Did Sasha make it home okay last night?" She texted me late, but I fell asleep before she replied. The coffee shop was loud enough that she didn't hear the specific quality of my silence. "She's fine," I said. "She got in late." Priya nodded, already looking back at her book. I ordered my coffee. I stood at the counter while it was made, and I thought about the text, "Staying at Priya's, don't worry." Sasha had not stayed at Priya's. The coffee was hot in my hand when I walked out. The April sun was already cutting hard and white across the parking lot. I sat in my car for a few minutes and thought about what I now knew and what it meant and what I was going to do with it. And then I drove home to the house where Sasha was making breakfast and the radio was on and everything looked exactly like it always had. Here is what our life looked like from the outside and from most of the inside. Functional, warm, genuinely good in the ways that matter. We had a house in North Scottsdale with a pool we actually used, a social life that was active without being exhausting, and a marriage that had survived the standard pressures. A difficult year financially when a big contract fell through, a period when Sasha's mother was sick and the weight of that had sat on everything, a season when we had grown slightly parallel instead of intersecting and had noticed and corrected. We were, by the accounting I had always used, a solid partnership. What I had not fully accounted for was the specific way Sasha's professional world had been expanding over the previous 18 months. She had picked up a major new client in November, a hospitality group that ran 3 venues in Scottsdale and 2 in Phoenix, high-end spaces that hosted everything from corporate retreats to private club events. The contract was her biggest to date, genuinely career-defining, and I had supported it without reservation because it was important to her, and because supporting her professional ambitions was simply part of how I understood my role in the marriage. The client's primary contact was a man named Trent. I had met Trent once at a venue launch in February, a brief introduction in a crowd of 100 people. Tall, well-dressed in the particular way of men whose work requires them to be well-dressed, with the easy social fluency of someone who had been professionally charming for years. He had shaken my hand and said something complimentary about Sasha's work and moved on, and I had moved on, and he had existed in my peripheral awareness as a name attached to a significant client and nothing more particular. In retrospect, February was already 3 months into something I didn't know about yet. The signs were there. I catalog them now with the specific clarity of hindsight, which is not the same as saying I should have seen them at the time, though perhaps I should have. The first was her phone, which had developed a new orientation. Sasha had always been open with her devices in the casual way of someone with nothing to protect. Phone on the counter, laptop visible. The natural transparency of a person who doesn't think about concealment because concealment isn't part of their operating system. Sometime in March that changed. Not dramatically. The phone began traveling with her between rooms. Notifications were cleared quickly. Once, coming to find her on the patio, I saw her close an app before the screen went dark. The specific thumb movement of someone ending something rather than pausing it. I noticed. I did not ask. The second sign was her energy after work events. This required more context to read correctly, because Sasha had always come home from events with a particular activated quality, the aftermath of hours spent managing complex social machinery, the specific high of a well-executed production. I knew that energy, had always found it attractive, the way she moved through the door still slightly lit from the work. What changed in the spring was the quality of that energy. It was less like professional satisfaction and more like something else, something private, contained, belonging to an experience she was carrying inward rather than sharing. I told myself it was the new client pressure. I told myself a lot of things in the spring. The third sign was what I privately called the geography of her schedule, the way certain events began requiring her presence at times that didn't align with their stated purpose. A venue walkthrough that ran until 11. A vendor meeting on a Saturday afternoon that I later established, from a piece of incidental information, had ended by 3. The hours between 3 and whenever she came home were not accounted for in any version of events she provided. But these were not confrontable facts. They were gaps, and gaps, in a marriage of 7 years, could be filled with almost anything. Trent's name began appearing with a frequency I found impossible to ignore. Not obsessively, not in a way that would have registered as unusual in isolation. But he was present in the texture of her professional conversation in a way that the primary contact for even a major client didn't quite account for. An opinion he'd had about a venue layout. A preference he'd mentioned for a particular style of event. Small details, the kind of details you retain about a person you are paying close attention to. I noted it. I said nothing. I was building a category I had not yet named. The category got its name on the Thursday she laughed and walked inside. The coffee shop encounter with Priya had given me one clean fact. Sasha had lied about where she spent Thursday night. Everything else remained technically unconfirmed. I had no direct evidence, no explicit proof, just the architecture of accumulated observation and one deliberate false statement about her location. The specific discipline required to operate normally inside a marriage while carrying that knowledge is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't done it. I went home that Saturday and ate the breakfast Sasha had made and talked about the weekend and watched her move through the kitchen and thought. She lied about where she was, and she did it without hesitation, and she believes I don't know. All of that ran parallel to the conversation about whether we should get the pool resurfaced this summer and what we were doing for Memorial Day. I realized, discovering a capacity for compartmentalization I hadn't known I possessed. I gave myself 1 week before doing anything. This was not passivity. It was the same instinct I brought to estimating a complex project. Don't commit to a number until you understand the full scope of the work. I had one data point. I needed more before I could build a reliable picture. What I did during that week was pay attention in a different register. Sasha's schedule for the following week included 2 evening events and 1 Saturday afternoon venue walkthrough. I tracked, without commenting, the actual time she arrived home against the time she said she would. Tuesday's event ended, per the venue's public social media, at 9:30. She arrived home at 11:40. A 2-hour gap on a Tuesday night that she described as cleanup and debrief with the client team. The Saturday walkthrough was more telling. She left at 1, said she'd be back by 5. At 3:15 her location, I had not installed any tracking, but we shared an Apple Family account she had set up 2 years ago and never deactivated, showed her at a residential address in Paradise Valley. Not a venue, not a vendor location, a private address. She arrived home at 5:45. Slightly flushed, slightly too composed, with a story about traffic on the 101 that I accepted without expression. Paradise Valley. I wrote down the address on a piece of paper and put it in my desk drawer. The red herring arrived from a direction that briefly derailed everything. Sasha's colleague, a woman named Becca who had worked with her for 3 years and whom I knew casually, sent me a direct message on Instagram in the second week of May. The message was hesitant, brief, clearly difficult to write. She said she'd noticed some concerning things about Sasha's behavior lately and wanted to make sure I was okay. I read the message 3 times. Then I called Becca. She answered quickly, as if she'd been waiting. What she told me was not what I expected. Becca believed that Sasha was in some kind of financial trouble, not an affair, but a debt situation. She had noticed Sasha making calls that seemed related to money, had overheard a fragment of a conversation that involved numbers and urgency, and had connected it to a general anxiety she'd observed in Sasha over the previous months. She was, Becca made clear, not certain of any of this. She was passing along an impression because she was concerned. I thanked her and sat with this for 3 days. The financial angle was plausible. Sasha handled her own business finances, and we had agreed years ago to maintain separate accounts alongside our joint household one, a structure that had always worked cleanly. If there was a problem there, I wouldn't necessarily see it in our shared accounts. I spent 2 days half convinced that what I was dealing with was financial concealment rather than infidelity, that the Paradise Valley address was a lender, a broker, some professional contact she was embarrassed about. On the 3rd day, I drove past the Paradise Valley address. It was a private residence, a well-maintained house behind a low wall, no signage, no professional presence. The kind of place a successful single man might live. I went home and crossed the financial theory off the list. The confirmation, the piece that moved everything from suspicion to certainty, came from Trent himself, though he didn't know he was providing it. Trent ran social media accounts for his venues, professionally managed, high-production content, the standard visual language of upscale, Scottsdale nightlife. I had looked at these accounts before in the incidental way you look at anything connected to your spouse's major client. In mid-May, I began looking at them more carefully. The venue he ran in Old Town had a recurring Friday night event, a private social club format, invitation only, the kind of thing that cultivated exclusivity as its primary product. The public-facing content was deliberately vague about what happened inside, but the aesthetic was clear: dim lighting, close proximity, the visual grammar of a space designed for things that didn't fully exist in daylight. I found, in the tagged photos from a March event, a photograph, not of Sasha directly, of Trent, in the venue, mid-conversation, and at the edge of the frame, partially cropped, a woman in a dress I recognized. The dress Sasha had worn to what she described as a client dinner on a Thursday in March. A Thursday she had come home from at midnight, slightly distant, saying the dinner had run late. The photograph was tagged by someone else, not by the venue's official account. A guest post. Sasha was not the subject. She was incidental background. But she was there, in his venue, on a Thursday she had described as a client dinner and not a club event. The distinction mattered. A client dinner was professional. A private club event on a Thursday night was something else. I screenshotted the photograph and sent it to no one. The second piece came from the Paradise Valley address. I had written it down. I ran it through county records. Publicly accessible, a fact I had known professionally for years, the kind of research I did routinely for project site verification. The property was registered to a holding company whose principal was listed as Trent. His house. She had been at his house on a Saturday afternoon for 2.5 hours. I sat at my desk with both pieces of information, the photograph and the property record, and did the thing I had been trained by years of estimating to do. I assembled the complete picture from the available data. The gaps in her schedule. The private club event she had described as a client dinner. The Saturday afternoon at his residence. The Thursday night she had not stayed at Prius. The picture was complete. It required no further assembly. What it required now was a decision about what to do with it. I chose not to confront her immediately. This was not weakness. This was the specific calculation of a man who understood that the confrontation would end the marriage that was now inevitable, and who wanted to control the terms of that ending rather than have them determined by an unplanned emotional eruption. I had 1 week before a work trip that would take me to Tucson for 3 days. I decided to use that week to organize what needed to be organized before the conversation happened. I called an attorney, a man named Patrick, referred by a colleague, who worked out of an office near Fashion Square and who had the precise, unruffled manner of someone who had heard every version of this story and was not surprised by any of them. We met for an hour. I told him what I knew and what I had. He told me what my options were. I left his office feeling something I hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly, but the particular steadiness of a man who has converted an unbearable uncertainty into a manageable set of actions. The week passed. I went to Tucson. I came back. On a Saturday evening in late May, with the desert light going gold and flat through the living room windows and the pool reflecting it in slow movement on the ceiling, I sat down across from Sasha and put the photograph on the coffee table between us. She looked at it for a long moment. The specific quality of her stillness in that moment. I had known Sasha for 10 years, and I had never seen her be that still. She was, in the ordinary flow of her life, a person in constant motion, not restless, but energized, always partially in the next moment. This stillness was different. The stillness of a person whose next move has been removed from the available options. That's from March, I said. The Thursday you said was a client dinner. She didn't confirm or deny it. She looked at the photograph the way you look at a piece of evidence that belongs to a version of events you had hoped would stay uncorroborated. I also have the property record for the Paradise Valley address, I said. The Saturday in April. Something shifted in her face. Not collapse. Sasha was not a person who collapsed. More like a recalibration, the specific internal adjustment of someone updating their understanding of what the other person knows. How long have you known? She asked. I've been certain for about 3 weeks. I've suspected longer. She looked at the window. The pool light was on, moving slow blue across the ceiling. Trent, I said. It wasn't a question. A pause. Then, yes. How long? She held my gaze for a moment before answering, and I understood that she was deciding how honest to be, and I watched her decide in favor of honesty, which was the first unguarded thing she had done in months. Since January, she said. January. For months before the April Saturday. 5 months before we were sitting here. The hospitality contract had started in November. By January, something had moved from professional to something else, which meant the entire architecture of a major career achievement had been built on top of something I hadn't been allowed to see. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to actually answer it. She waited. The night you laughed. When I said I trusted you. On the porch. She didn't look away. What was funny? A long silence. The pool light kept moving. It wasn't funny, she said finally. It was, I don't know, painful maybe, because you did trust me and I knew what I was walking back inside to. You were texting him. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. That's what I thought, I said. I picked up the photograph from the coffee table. I put it in my jacket pocket. The action was deliberate, not aggressive, just final. The gesture of a man closing a file. I've already spoken to an attorney, I said. I wanted to have this conversation before anything formal, because you deserve that. But I need you to understand that I'm not asking whether this is fixable. I already know it isn't. She started to speak. Not because of him specifically, I said. Because of the laugh. Because of Priya. Because of 5 months of a version of our life that was real to me and wasn't fully real. It was real, she said. Cal, what we have is real. What we had, I said, and the tense correction landed in the room with a quiet finality that stopped her. She pressed her hands together on her knees. She was not crying, which surprised me. She was doing what she always did when something was genuinely difficult. She was present. Fully, painfully present. The same quality that had struck me at the rooftop party 10 years ago, the quality I had spent 7 years believing was mine. I'm sorry, she said. I know. That's not enough. No, I agreed. It isn't. We sat in the living room for another hour. Not arguing. There was nothing to argue about. The facts were the facts, and we both knew them, and the conversation was about something else. The accounting of a marriage, the honest inventory of what had been good and what had gone wrong, and what we both understood about how we had arrived here. She told me more than I had asked to know, and I let her tell it because she needed to, and because I had, against my own expectations, reached a point of stillness about it that allowed me to listen without being destroyed by what I was hearing. Trent was not a passing thing. She had feelings for him that she had not fully resolved. She did not know what she wanted. She said all of this with the specific honesty of a woman who had decided, in this room, to stop managing the situation and just be in it. I found, to my own surprise, that I respected her for it. It didn't change anything, but I respected it. The divorce took 4 months. Patrick was efficient and fair, and Sasha's attorney was professional, and the process had the exhausted civility of 2 people dismantling something that had been genuinely built. We sold the house in September. I moved into an apartment in Tempe, near the water, with east-facing windows and a balcony that looked out over the dry riverbed of the Salt. Sasha moved into a place in Old Town that was closer to the venues she worked. I learned through the residue of mutual acquaintances that she and Trent had continued seeing each other after the divorce. I registered this information and moved on. It was, in the specific way of things you have already accounted for and processed, not news. The work helped. It always helps, for the kind of person I am, the sequenced, logical kind, the kind who finds stability in projects that behave according to their variables. I threw myself into a large commercial estimate that had been languishing on my desk since spring, and the discipline of it, the hours of measurement and calculation, and the particular satisfaction of a number that was honest, was its own kind of recovery. I also, in the fall, started running again. I had run in my mid-20s and stopped when the contracting work expanded and the evenings got shorter. I picked it back up in October, first thing in the morning before the Arizona heat arrived, through the quiet streets of Tempe with the sky going from black to gray to the specific pale gold of a desert sunrise. It was not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. It was simply a thing I had stopped doing that I started doing again, which is, I think, a reasonable description of what recovery looks like in practice. I met Elena at a project site meeting in November. She was a civil engineer with the municipality, one of the client-side contacts on a drainage infrastructure project I was estimating. And she had the particular brand of quiet competence that I had always found more compelling than any other quality. We talked about soil permeability for 40 minutes, and then, at the end of the meeting, she asked if I wanted coffee, and I said yes. And we had coffee for an hour and talked about everything except soil permeability. I did not rush it. I had understood, a person who needed to move at a deliberate pace through new things, and Elena, who had her own reasons for deliberateness that she shared gradually and honestly over the following months, was suited to that pace. We were not a completed story by the end of the year. We were a beginning, which is what that stage of a thing is. I drove past the venue on a Friday night in December. Not to see Sasha, not intentionally. I was driving back from a site visit, and the route took me through Old Town, and there it was, the venue lit and full, the line at the door, the world Trent had built, and that Sasha now inhabited professionally and personally. I thought about the porch, the driveway, the desert night. I trust you, I had said, and she had laughed and walked inside, and I had stood there with my keys not knowing what had just happened to me. I know now, not as bitterness. The bitterness had been real and had burned through its fuel and was gone. But as information, the laugh had been real. The pain in it, as she'd said, had been real. She had known she was walking back inside to something that was already consuming the ground we'd built together. And the laugh was the sound of a person who couldn't figure out any other way to hold two irreconcilable things at the same time. I understand that. I don't forgive it, exactly, but I understand it. I drove home to the Tempe apartment. Elena had texted about the weekend. I stood on the balcony for a while in the December night, which was cool in the specific way of Arizona winters. Not cold, just the absence of heat, the desert exhaling after months of furnace work, and looked out over the dry riverbed and thought about drainage and permeability and the way water always finds its level eventually, regardless of the channels you've built to contain it. Then I went inside and replied to the text. What makes Cal's story resonate is not the betrayal itself, but the economy of the moment that preceded it. The laugh on the porch, brief, involuntary, impossible to interpret cleanly in the moment, was the story's emotional ground zero. Not because it proved anything, but because it was honest in a way that everything that followed was not. Sasha, in that fraction of a second, was fully herself, carrying two realities simultaneously and unable, in that specific moment of her husband's open trust, to manage the weight of both without something slipping. That laugh was the only moment in months when she wasn't performing composure. Cal felt it. He stood in the driveway holding his keys with something unnameable in his chest. And then he drove to the hardware store and bought caulk he didn't need and went to bed because the alternative was to follow the feeling somewhere he wasn't ready to go. The red flags accumulated with the particular patience of things that are waiting to be seen. The phone's new orientation, the energy she brought home from events, changed in quality, contained rather than shared, and the geography of her schedule that kept producing hours she couldn't fully account for. Each was individually explicable, collectively damning. But the flag with the sharpest edge was the one Cal encountered entirely by accident. Priya, in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, asking whether Sasha had made it home okay after a night she had claimed to spend there. One sentence. No confrontation, no investigation, no intention on Priya's part to expose anything. Just the ordinary collision of two people's Saturday routines and a question that couldn't be answered honestly. That accidental moment was the first crack. And it came not from Cal's suspicion, but from the natural entropy of a sustained deception. The way a lie, maintained across enough people and enough time, will eventually contradict itself in a moment no one planned. The first real turning point was Cal's decision, after Priya's inadvertent disclosure, to observe rather than confront. This is where his character reveals itself, not as passive, but as precise. He needed the full picture before he could act on any part of it, which meant 2 weeks of parallel functioning. Normal breakfasts, normal evenings, normal conversations. While he built the case from location data and public records and a photograph that existed because a venue guest had tagged a post. The second turning point was the confrontation itself, specifically the moment Cal asked about the laugh. He didn't ask about Trent. He didn't enumerate the evidence. He asked about the porch, the laugh, what it had meant. And Sasha, who had been managing and calculating throughout, answered him honestly. It was painful, because you trusted me and I knew what I was walking back inside to. That honesty, arriving too late to save anything, was also the most genuinely intimate moment the story contained. Two people, finally in the same room at the same time. The lesson that lives inside this isn't a warning about nightlife or professional proximity or the particular vulnerabilities of an event coordinator's world. It's about the cost of a marriage that has no regular mechanism for examining its own interior, where trust is assumed rather than tended, and the distance between two people can grow without either person naming it until someone else fills it. Cal had never asked what Sasha needed. Not because he didn't care, but because the marriage appeared to be working, and working things don't usually invite that kind of examination. The appearance of stability had been doing the work that actual conversation should have been doing, and when the appearance finally cracked, there was nothing structural beneath it. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that Sasha and Trent continued after the divorce. Not as indictment, but as information about what she had actually been navigating. This wasn't a reckless moment or a temporary disorientation, but a genuine reorientation toward a different life. Which means Cal wasn't only betrayed by a person who had made a mistake. He was living alongside someone who had already, at some interior level, begun to leave, and who hadn't found the honesty or the courage to say so until the deception had been doing the leaving for her. That distinction matters psychologically. Deception as a substitute for a direct conversation is one of the most common and least examined ways relationships end. It allows the person leaving to avoid the confrontation of leaving while still, functionally, leaving. The partner who stays is left not just with the betrayal, but with the disorienting question of how long the departure had already been in progress. For Cal, the answer was at least January, probably earlier. 7 years of a solid marriage, and the last several months of it had been a performance of continuity by someone who had already moved on. What the story ultimately reveals is that recovery is possible, and that it looks nothing like the dramatic arc people expect. It looks like running in the morning. It looks like a drainage meeting and an honest conversation about soil. It looks like a balcony in December and a text you actually want to answer. The detail I keep returning to is the caulk. Cal drove to a hardware store and bought caulk he didn't need because he didn't know what else to do with what he'd just felt. That's such a human thing. That's what we do when something lands too big to process. We find the smallest possible task, and we do it, because doing something feels marginally better than standing still in a driveway holding our keys. Nobody talks about that part. The gap between the moment you feel something is wrong and the moment you're ready to act on it is filled with caulk you don't need, and sleep you can't get, and conversations about pool resurfacing. That gap is where most of the real damage happens. And most of us have stood in that driveway at least once, holding our keys, not quite ready to name what we already know.